Okay, folks, let's get underway. Good evening, welcome. Good to see some of the familiar faces joining us again. I'm Robb, the CEO of Mass Participation World. Delighted to be joined by a hugely experienced and expert panel tonight. Our topic, practical guidelines for creating COVID-safe plans that maximize your chance of gaining permit approval. And this is a result of the survey we did on the last webinar. We asked people what their biggest headaches and challenges were at the moment. And it was a combination of both of those, people saying getting COVID-safe plans together and getting permit approval. So delighted tonight to be joined by Craig Sheridan, Managing Director, Sheridan Consulting Group, joining us from Sydney in Australia. Welcome, Craig. Thanks. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here, mate. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Marcel, Altenburg, Senior Lecturer and Program Coordinator, Crowd Science at Manchester Metropolitan University, would normally be joining us from Manchester, but he's interrupted his honeymoon to join us from Southampton in England as he travels back to Germany to hopefully watch the first Bundesliga match with crowds. Welcome, Marcel. Thanks so much for making the time. Hopefully we can hear you there. I got your wave. And then Hugh, Managing Director, Event Health Management, and also the Medical Director of the Singapore Marathon, joining us from Perth in Australia. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you again. And both you and Marcel have been on a couple of our other webinars already during this series. So wonderful to see you again. As usual, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll keep the microphones mute, please, so we don't get any feedback. We are recording this. It will be posted on YouTube. Had a little bit of a technical hitch and I'm not sure that I'm able to stream on Facebook, but once we get Craig's presentation underway, I'm going to try my best to get it up on Facebook Live again. Just a couple of the usual announcements and a couple of additional ones that I'd like to share. For those of you that have heard them many times, bear with me, but for the newbies, I think hopefully gives you some insights in terms of some of the other initiatives. We will be announcing very soon a Mass Participation World Online Summit, and that is almost certainly going to be in the last week of September. We got some great feedback from our survey, which we've almost finished collating in terms of the format. Most people indicate they prefer 2 half-day events, so we will be giving some more information and a save the date on that. Those of you that are avid followers of the Aid Station, and thanks for all the amazing feedback that we've been having. I think we put out edition 70 last week. You would have noticed that there hasn't been any action this week. I've been running pretty hard for 4 months now, and my amazing wife, Tet, does all the editing. I hit the wall a little bit last week, and we're currently on a little bit of a break. So we've taken this week off on the Aid Station, but we'll be back next week, and we have some amazing interviews. I interviewed Dave Moorcroft a couple of days ago. Those of you that are of my vintage would remember him as the former world 5,000 meter record holder, incredible human being, incredibly humble man. We've got a wonderful interview with him. Carlo Capalgo, who many of you will know from Run Check, is going to be on the show, and a wonderful interview with Mershan from, he's the race director of the Diraju road races in the Maldives. Just an incredible story of how they started these events, and it's created an amazing running boom in a country as disparate from an island's perspective. In Male, the capital, which is one of the most populous cities in the world, and an amazing story. So there'll be that and more to come. We've been asked quite regularly from people as, how can we do a bit of a deeper dive? And what I'm going to be doing later on in the webinar is I'm going to be putting a poll out. And we're looking to launch in the next couple of weeks some masterclasses and masterminds, which give the opportunity to get more information from, for example, the 3 experts that we have on here tonight. So one of the first ones that we're going to be offering is masterclasses, which will be about an hour and a half, 2-hour session in much more detail. And then masterminds, which will be small groups of 8 to 10 people in a workshop style situation, individually with each of. There'll be one on risk management with Craig, there'll be one on medical plans with Hugh, and there'll be one on crowd science and crowd control and the like with Marcel. So there'll be some, just wanting to get some feedback from you in terms of how you feel about those. And then we'll be launching those in the next couple of weeks. As always, if I can help you in any way, please send me directly questions, chris@chrisrobb.asia. connect with me on LinkedIn, follow the Mass Participation World Facebook or YouTube channels, and there's quite a lot of information there. Whilst I go through with just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about, I always like to understand who's on the call for the benefit of everyone. So I've just launched a poll there. If you wouldn't mind telling us where you come from. So as always, we've got about an hour, by now probably 55 or 54 minutes or so. We're going to be starting with a formal presentation, so slightly different format to the past. Craig's going to do about a 15-minute presentation on risk management, and then I'll be watching the questions with those. Might do a quick summary and grab maybe 1 or 2 questions for Craig. We'll then hand over to Hugh, who'll do a 15-minute presentation on medical plans, and then same thing. We'll try and feed some questions in, and then we'll finish up with Marcel, who'll talk about social distancing, crowd flows, crowd management, and so on. So, and then obviously at the end, I'll do a quick wrap up as I always do, and we'll do questions. If it looks like we've got a whole bunch of questions and we need to try and go beyond the hour, I'll do the summary, I'll beg forgiveness and try and get to as many of those questions as possible with maybe an extra 10, maximum 15 minutes of those. Looks like just sharing the results of that. As always, 62% from mass participation. We got some people from music and festivals, from people from not-for-profit, and some others in there. So I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm just going to quickly pop in the second one, which gives us a sense of what kind of services you provide, whilst at the same time I just get the presentation up and running for Craig, so that we can get underway with Craig's presentation. Let's just give a quick minute, and as expected, we're going here predominantly event organizers, suppliers. We've got some permitting agencies on the line, so let me just end that and quickly share the results. As always, as I say, quick big group of event organizers, but we've got a group of others there. So Craig, why don't we now throw over to you? Your deck is live there. I think it's, let me just start it as a slideshow here right from the front, so we're not seeing all of your slides at once from the beginning, and let you take it away there, Craig, with your presentation on the risk management side, please.
Thanks very much, Chris, and it's great to be here with everyone tonight. And really interesting seeing that poll, and I'm glad to see that 66% are event organisers. Because, you know, the first thing we're going to talk tonight is a guide to COVID-19 safety planning for events. That's what we all have to do at the moment. We have to determine our event viability, and that's what we're going to run through here tonight. So if you just don't mind going to the next slide, please, Chris.
Sure, Craig. There we go.
Excellent. So determining our event viability, you need to do the following things. So the first thing we need to do is familiarise ourselves with any approved industry frameworks which are applicable to the event. So, for example, I think all industries at the moment, and I've been going through them one by one, have industry frameworks, guidelines, you know, associations have put out their guidelines. So I implore you all to go and have a look at those guidelines, frameworks, because a lot of them are very good and they're specific to that particular industry. So if you're into marathons, triathlons, swimming, cycling, whatever your industry is, your industry has a framework and a guidelines to go and look at. That's the first thing you do. The next thing's not so easy. Talking to stakeholders, jurisdictional government authorities, councils, any other associations. I've been involved with a new association, Australian Mass Participation Sporting Event Alliance, which we've been doing a lot of work with, you know, to get a lot of mass participation events back up and running again in the last few months, and it's going really, really well. A good friend of mine who's on that executive of AMSI, Wayne Larden, with the city, he runs and owns the Sydney Running Festival, Blackmore Sydney Running Festival. You'd all know about that, formerly known as the Sydney Marathon. Chris, I've heard you refer to that a few times as that. He can't even talk to police at the moment. You know, he's reaching out to police. They're saying, sorry, Wayne, we're too busy. We're closing a border down between New South Wales and Victoria. There's other issues up on the Queensland border as well. So in the middle of a COVID crisis, in the middle of the pandemic, you know, you've got to look at those challenges in front of us at the moment. And agencies have other priorities. So it's about, you know, keep trying to talk to them, bring them in and ask them advice and get them on board in your team. Local government councils, they'll certainly come to the table and talk to you. Events mean so much to them, you know, economic spend, the visitor economy, all that type of thing. And local travel is, you know, high on the government's, you know, agenda at the moment, you know, to get people moving around locally and travelling to regions. So local government's really high at the moment in a priority list for event organisers to go and talk to. So really go and have a look at them. The next step is to develop appropriate planning documentation, meeting event requirements, okay? And to do that, number one, 101, we've got to, and being a risk management person, we have to conduct our risk assessment and complete our risk management documents. So remember, risk mitigations need to be put into place, and they must include a strategy to address the COVID crisis, okay? A risk management plan gives you a baseline, and the baseline is for the venue, their risk management plan. I mean, you overlay that with an event risk management plan. So you've got two there. Go and have a look at each of your venues' risk management plans. You'll see 99% of venues will have their own risk management plan in place, and then overlay it with your particular event risk management plan. And then you must address both inherent risk ratings and also come up with residual risk ratings in that risk register to see what your mitigation strategy is going to be, and who is going to own that strategy, who are going to own that treatment options towards that risk. So you've got to list that in your plans there. You need to develop communications plans. You need to develop safety and security plans, emergency management plans, crowd management plans, which Marcel will speak on later, and procedures. And certainly, you know, I've left that off there, but medical plans, which Hugh will touch on as well. And they all align. So the risk management work must bring all those plans into one. And you have to have a suite of documentation to move forward, to show government, to show the venue that you're across your event and you have the appropriate mitigation plan in place for COVID-19. Communication plans, that's really, really critical, you know, being able to get those messages out to the public, which way to come to an event, how to leave an event, how to circulate around an event, right? Your comms plan, your signage about, you know, social distancing or physical distancing, where your sanitisation stations are, what type of disinfectant you're using. All these things must be contained in your comms plan and telling people when to come. For example, you know, we're talking, I know Brad Gander's online tonight from Vivid Sydney. We're talking about, you know, giving people times to come. We're throwing ideas up at the moment, you know, to reduce the crowd. We know that there's only a certain level of crowds that are allowed on public transport at the moment. So again, that'll work in our favour because we can drip feed the crowds into that event area and the like. So these comms plans are critical, right? How to come, what transport to take, how to be safe. We've got to get those messages out to the public. Resource planning and site inductions. You really got to think about our staffing for this, you know, and how we induct our staff to the site. I know there's a lot of good systems out there for site inductions at the moment, but again, we have to really plan for that, and resource planning is critical. We can go into that in more detail again, Chris, in the master classes when we do that. When we get to that level and have our suite of documentation, we then seek approvals, permits from the appropriate jurisdictional authorities. And that's critical. Once you get that permit, you're off and running and you can go and develop it. Before you get that permit, you know, stakeholders and agencies are going to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row, all those documents in place, all those stakeholders you've engaged to bring them on board with your event. And then you go and seek your approval, your permit, and lodge, and then you're away and running. The next slide, please, Chris. A bit of a checklist, an overline checklist for you. So use your official sources to keep up to date with facts on COVID-19. So I'm talking about, excuse me, that's my dog. I've been barking, I'll let him out of the room. Apologies for that, guys. There's always a hiccup in the room.
As long as he's not on the marathon course running in front of runners, we're fine, Craig.
He's too small to be on the marathon
welcome
course.
at this stage.
Yeah, good on you, mate. So again, use official sources to keep up to date with the facts on COVID-19. Your COVID-19 safety plans have to align, one, to the WHO, right? World Health Organization, the pillars and framework of the World Health Organization. And then we go to the plans and guidelines from your Commonwealth or federal governments, and then right down to, if you have states, your state or jurisdictional government guidelines. And they all must align to those plans. So everything is done in unison with the WHO, with your Commonwealth government and your state government. Identify, okay? Identify if it's an approved COVID safe industry plan for your event. And that goes back to looking at your industry and associations guidelines and frameworks. So identify if there's an approved safety industry plan. The COVID safe industry plan will be an overall plan, but it's a horses for courses. You'll have to tailor that industry plan to your particular event. For example, in AMSI, we're putting out guidelines for all events, for all industries, right? To look at these guidelines, which are aligned to who, aligned to our Commonwealth government, to our state governments. But again, you have to tailor that for your specific event. For example, staggered start times, plans around your race villages, aid stations along the way. What are we doing for COVID safety along with them? For instance, for Ironman or a City to Surf event, for every one runner, you're getting, 4 or 5 support staff or family waiting at the end. How are we keeping them safe? The people at the end, and for an event such as City to Surf with 85,000 runners, you're talking 250, 300,000 people waiting at the finish line for people to come through at Bondi Beach. And that's a big, big challenge in this COVID environment we're in at the moment. We determine the level of event approval required, and we refer to the jurisdictional requirements. So a safety plan versus a safety checklist. Okay, implement. For every event, we must implement a COVID safety coordinator. Okay, every event. So that person, and that's straight out of here in Australia from our Commonwealth government, that if you want to put an event on, you have to have a COVID safety coordinator. And that's at the venues and for your event. They're there to coordinate to make sure everyone's doing the right thing and all components of the plan are being put into place. We develop a COVID safety plan that considers emergency planning, right? EVAC strategy, how we get out if there was an incident, an explosion, a fire, smoke, if there was any panic, right? So that COVID safety plan must consider emergency planning. And certainly I know Marcel will speak about that in relation to crowd management. Again, I can't reiterate the importance. It's so important to establish relationships with key community partners and stakeholders. All right, keep pushing. I know it's hard. I've used, Wayne's example, how hard it is at the moment to get a hold of the police. You've just got to keep pushing. They will come back to you. Submit your COVID safe event plan. Agencies might come back and want you to tweak it, submit it as a draft, and invite their feedback. I think that's really good. Be open and transparent. Feedback is a good thing, especially from people in control and in authority. Update and distribute an accurate comms plan. Spoke about comms before amongst your relevant stakeholders. Be clear what we're talking about, and also ensure all resources and suppliers adopt the specified strategies under the safety plan. So it's got one more slide, Chris.
Yeah, sorry, Craig. There you go.
Thanks, mate. So just delving down into a little bit of detail. So determine whether a ratio of 1 per 4 square metres per person can always be maintained across an event, for example, in event structure. And that's what we're working with here in Australia at the moment. Are the COVID safety measures flexible, right? If the event needs to be modified, can we change them on the run? Do we have a contingency plan? Mitigation strategies have to include disinfecting, sanitisation, screening of people, and trace management. And that works in line with your security plan. Being able to screen people through for temperature checks, sanitisation, disinfecting, can allow us to look at people as they come through and use the security. And I know the police are really keen on doing that at the moment, so it works hand in hand. Provide those prevention supplies at events, sanitisation, disinfectant measures, PPE, face masks, etc. Plan for staff absences. We're seeing a lot of particular events that are trying to get up and running at the moment, having a lot of staff absences at the moment across the country. Promote messages that discourage people from feeling unwell from attending. We know that. Plan for disease surveillance and detection with a space to isolate staff or participants who become ill at the event. You plan to have a place, you know, like an area where we can isolate people, right? It's not just about a set down or first aid area, triage area, and Hugh will talk on that as we get to Hugh. Plan to limit contact between participants and staff supporting the event. Develop flexible refund policy for participants. That is an absolute must, right? You have to be flexible around refund policies because this situation is changing day by day and is going up and down at the moment. And circulation of up-to-date and accurate comms again in the lead up to the event. Keep people informed and up to date what is happening. So that's my virtually high level key COVID-19 planning considerations and safety plans, planning to get events back up and running in this time, in this COVID situation we're finding ourselves all in at the moment.
That's great. Thanks so much, Craig. So many great points. Loved your flow chart there with all the different steps on it. I'm going to keep moving. Encourage everyone, if you've got some questions, throw them into either the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try and pick those up towards the end. I'm just going to quickly, before I throw over to Hugh, and Hugh, I think just in the essence of time, we might just keep using the master deck here, and I'll just work it through for you rather than share to you. I'm just going to put a poll out there just to get a sense of where people feel in terms of the frequency of how often that they'd like these events and timing as well. So just throw that out there as we move to the next slide to give Hugh the opportunity to come forward with his presentation. There you go, Hugh. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Chris. And good morning to everyone in the Americas, afternoon to everyone in Europe and across Africa, Middle East, and finally evening to everyone in Asia Pacific. I would encourage everyone to have any questions that come up during this short window to flick them through in the chat box. And the reason being, there is so much to encompass around what goes into a medical plan that I'm going to focus solely on areas of common weaknesses from a lot of the plans that you look at around the place and I pick up and read and people ask second opinions on, or looking at historical data. So rather than focus on all areas of plans, I'll focus on some key areas of things that should go in and probably don't need to go in. So there's a couple of key areas as we start to work through each of these slides. We'll flick over to the first one.
Yeah.
And
there you go.
Medical plans, the planning process involves an element of planning, which might seem simple and obvious, but it's something that I'm going to distinguish the difference between planning and plans for some really key reasons. The actual content that goes into the documents, some COVID specific information, very much understanding a lot of interest in medical at the moment is focused around management of COVID, how, where, what do we need to do, and how does it integrate in with not only broader medical operations, but across any entire site, event, project. And then the fourth point that we've got here is spend a couple of minutes focusing on the unnecessary. Medical being a very complex area, we often have a habit of throwing so much information into it that there are things we put in that, one, don't belong in that space and can complicate it. Two, they can be counterintuitive to some of those other plans that we've got. And as Craig alluded to a minute ago, every plan has to integrate with each other. And everyone in our industry is aware of that. It is a challenge when you are trying to align risk management plans, emergency management plans, crowd management plans, medical plans, and all the others that we have in place. The last thing that we need to be doing is putting in unnecessary information, even though it's often in the hope that by putting more in, we have everything that we need. So we'll flick over and get stuck into some of the key components of medical plans. As we flip through this slide, we'll find there's a subtle difference between a medical plan and the planning process. And while it's obvious to most people, it's really, really important to distinguish between what the two actually are. The plan has to be reflective of what it is that we've gone through and what we actually have in place. The next point I'll talk through is around plans are only as good as your actual planning. Planning, delivery go hand in hand. There's some complexity around medical operations that often we find there's areas that we're not comfortable in putting down on paper. There's a lot of medical knowledge. There's a lot of very specific clinical information. So it's very hard to know what to put into a plan and what not to put into the plan. So we have this question over what's relevant and what isn't. And in the search of trying to come up with plans that are comprehensive, too often we find medical plans are produced with information that doesn't belong, or we're trying to find information and we're trying to expand information to fill what we think needs to be in there that we don't know. And I'd encourage everyone to avoid going down that path. It's okay not to have every answer available. It's about making sure you know where you can find that information. Medical plans are quite specific. And the last thing you want to be doing is trying to find holes in it. It's far better to go looking for that information. And there are some fantastic resources available. If you're not sure where to look for those, start asking around. There are some very good information sources out there and plenty of people that can help. The plan ultimately is only going to be as good as what your planning process is and what it is that you actually put in play. The medical plan itself is best placed to be a document that reflects what it is that's going on the ground. So the next couple of points on this slide talk about what detail goes into the plan. And that's relevant because we're talking about complexities. And there's different complexities in medical planning and operations for a race of 2,000 people that covers a distance of 5 or 10 kilometers compared to marathon distance with 40, 50, 60,000. Like we see with the World Marathon major races. We see cycling races have different complexities and different challenges. There is no one template that fits all. We don't have a template that applies to cycling, to triathlon, to swimming, to running. There's nothing that's going to fit those categories of sport and participation, let alone the type of event, the distance, the time, the local conditions, the environment, the demographics. There is no one template that says these are the things you definitively need in it. This is what you don't need in it. And to the next layer, what level of detail do I actually have in there? So a lot of the detail in any medical plan will be determined on these two factors, the complexities of medical planning and the medical operations that will be in place in the race. The second detail the second determination of that level of detail, is the audience of the plan. Who's the plan being written for? If the plan is being built as part of that collection, we have risk management plans, we have a crowd management plan, we have a whole lot of plans that are compiled and put together to provide a comprehensive view of what our event looks like. If that plan is primarily built for the purposes of compliance and the approval process, think about what information needs to go into it. And some of the unnecessary information that commonly gets included that we don't need to, I'll address later. But it does dictate the feel of the plan and the detail of information. It's very, very specific to who you're talking to. And no more relevant in medical is it relevant than where we're talking about taking very technical information and applying it to somebody who actually needs to interpret it. The best medical plans are not the ones that are filled with jargon, with medical information that's difficult to interpret and impossible to interpret. It's actually the opposite. So have a very clear understanding of what it is that your plan is doing in the approval process in terms of informing stakeholders, and differentiate between what information do external stakeholders to your race or your event need versus what information do internal stakeholders need. There's two very different sets of information, and that external stakeholder set of information should very much remain high level. It's not about secrets of internal operations. It's more focused on what do stakeholders need at a higher level. And there's some of the key things I'll address at the moment, because too often medical plans focus on internal working detail that don't answer the questions that we need to external stakeholders. So there are some key things that you probably need before you even start going through what do you put into your plan. And as we work through the next couple of slides around some of the inclusions in this plan, these are the kinds of pieces of information I'd suggest that you actually have. What do you actually got? It's very clear that we need to understand what we have in place or what we will have in place. Your medical plan is not the time and place to talk about what you think you need and bridge a gap with what we don't have. We don't want to be talking about what we think's needed in a compliance sense or trying to oversell what we actually have. There are very few events around the world that would have what would be considered an extensive, broad, holistic medical capacity on site. It's not necessary. The larger the race, the larger the event, the higher the risk, and when we model through the specifics of every event, that will inform what type of resourcing we actually have on site. We don't need to paint a picture of high-end capacity. There are very few races and events in the world where we need to have high-end care. There are very few races in the world where you're expected to have operating capacity on site. Anyone from Formula One is familiar with having to have capacity of surgical teams on site. But if you're not working on Formula One, or one of the few exceptions, you wouldn't dream of trying to replicate operating theatres on site. There is no expectation that we have an entire medical capacity and health system at any given event. It's very much about meeting those needs. So starting the process off, be very clear about what you have in place. And if you find you're in a position where you're writing a plan to bridge a gap to where you think you need to be compared to what you've got, then you need to go back to the start of the process. The medical plan is not the time and place to come and overstate how much you've got in place. The other difficulty with it is when someone reads through it. If I read through a medical plan that someone submits to me, it's very clear if someone talks to me about capacity of intensive care and critical care on site, and it's got capacity for response times to be a certain time limit on it. And we talk about how many patients we can have on site. And I can read that plan and see if you've got a team of 6 people and this is the size of your site, it's very easy to distinguish that between the resourcing, the operations and how it's set up doesn't align with the level of care that's been described in other parts of the document. So the document at a high level should be able to be read through and things line up relatively well. And that's the first checking point of a medical plan to see if it makes sense. The final point on this slide is about making sure that it's easily understood by somebody with less technical understanding. The purpose of the plan is not to tell somebody with a technical understanding what they're doing. The purpose of the plan is about explaining how does medical operations and how does a medical capacity fit within the broader event. It is a particularly complex challenge when planning medical because it involves highly technical information and skills, and it involves quite often medical personnel who don't have a great understanding of some of the rest of the event environments in which we all work. The medical plan is a key document to bridging that gap, not about talking to show that we have a particular level of care on site if we're not sure. It is very important that this plan is very easily understood by external stakeholders and internal stakeholders alike. And I can't encourage that enough. The more that we complicate it and the more that it's difficult to read, the more gaps usually align with any medical plan. So I can't reinforce that enough, that it really needs to be something that's easily understood. The best plan in the world should be read by somebody who hasn't been directly involved in medical planning, can read it and understand who is responsible for what and how the picture actually fits together. We have a team. I have an understanding of communications, and there's some breakdown areas that we'll flick onto in a few slides' time about some of those key areas. But bear in mind when we get there, this is about someone who hasn't been involved in the process, understanding what's there, and to be able to pick up that plan and run with it so the person who wrote it, if they're not available, is not caught up and the plan's unable to be executed. As we flick over to the next slide, there's another series of points here about things that need to be included. So before we start jotting them down, and there's 4 points on this slide. The first one is resources. The second one is operations. Our third is communications. And the fourth is mass casualty. Now, there are 200, 300, 5,000 points I could put onto this slide, but I've picked these, and at the beginning of this, I started off by saying we're tackling some common weaknesses here. A medical plan doesn't tell me anything by telling me how many of something you have. So it doesn't matter if you tell me you have 10 nurses, 10 doctors, 10 first responders. That doesn't help me in any way, shape, or form to be able to understand it. A medical plan is not about how many of what have you got. I need to be able to derive information. So unless I can break that down with further information, simply listing the number and type of resources in itself won't be of much benefit to me. What I'm far more interested in understanding is what capacity have we got? And these are the kinds of questions that you need to ask yourself before you address these 4 categories and the next 100. So if you're writing the plan, or if you're involved in writing the plan and having input, these are the things I'd like you to ask yourself. Do I understand the capacity of the medical team? Do I understand the location of the resources that we actually have in place? And those resources are both human resources and non-human resources. Do I understand the level of care we have available on site? And where is that level of care? Because it's not common to have the same level of care across an entire event site. The tyranny of distance in mass participation events is challenging for medical as it is everybody else. So we don't expect to have the same high level of care. We all know that there's a higher level of care at the finish line, immediately after the finish line, and at the latter stages of any course. There are a greater number of medical presentations and those of higher acuity. That's an expectation, and we accept that that's how it is. However, we do need to know what level of care we have where. That gives me more information as to whether it's going to be appropriate, and it gives me a better course of information that we can make informed decisions as to whether we need to take somebody to somewhere close or whether they can be taken to somebody with further away that has a higher and more appropriate level of care. So understanding the level of care provided on site and where it's available is more important. So too are response times. You can't write about resources and operations and communications and mass casualty and 100 other scenarios if you don't understand what response times are. Because jotting down that you have 80 volunteers or 20 professional staff means nothing if we can't interpret what it means in that context. And some of the response times, and they're not things that necessarily need to be written in the plan, and I'd usually advise not to write these in a plan for a range of reasons. What about the time it takes for a first responder to get to any incident at any part of your event? What about transport times? So to evacuate and transport somebody from site to an on-site facility or to an off-site facility. Understanding what those times look like are so much more important as to understanding whether you have appropriate medical resourcing and appropriate medical plans in site than telling me how many of a particular category of person that you have. Contingency resources are really important as well. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but only in light detail. By essence, contingency resources come into play with any permutation of often foreseen, but sometimes unforeseen event. And we're talking about emergencies that unfold, of which we have to be prepared. By definition, medical operations at mass participation events push on the very definition of what a mass casualty event actually is. And the difference is whether we have the resources to deal with it on site or not. So one of the measurables to avoid ourselves in a situation of not having the resources available to be able to deal with a mass casualty event and pushing over that threshold of being able to deal with it is a thorough planning process. And writing this plan is a good way of assessing and checking that we're not going to find ourselves on the wrong side of that threshold. Another very important piece of information to understand before you write about these 4 points on the screen is a communication structure. So talking to me about communications is important in your plan, but you can't talk to me about it if you actually don't have it in place. And we're talking through a number of details, both external and internal. So I'll go through each of these 4 points briefly to give you an overview of what it is that I'm referring to in each of them. But there are layers of details that go further down, as I alluded to at the start of this. There are difficulties in putting a generic rule as to how much information about each of these 4 points, and others do I go into. But this will give you a somewhat of a starting point about what you need to consider. By way of resources, we need to understand human and non-human resources. In operations, we need to understand our deployment of getting those resources out. Whereabouts are they? Are they broken up into different posts along the post or along our site and along across the event? What size have we got? How do we move things around? How do we move resources? Communications is important, not just internally and not just externally. And the definitions of those in terms of a medical context, external communication from your medical operations is anything that goes either inbound or outbound to medical. And that's really important because medical by definition is so often reactive that it's not needed until somebody says, I need medical here and now where I am. Therefore, I need to know how to communicate. How do I find the medical resources that I need and bring them to me? So a communications plan is important in its own right. And our medical communication structure and plans internally must be set up in a way to support our overall picture of what we're doing at an event-wide level. If we're talking about a medical plan that's angled at external stakeholders of the event, and we're talking to those external stakeholders about approval, we need to consider both of those layers. We need to consider what it is that an external person would want to see. One, how can I find medical teams and communicate with them? And two, how do those medical teams communicate with each other? So you must have a clear differentiation between what's coming in and out in an external sense from those medical operations and how that communication happens on the internal level. There's a lot of detail that can be put in behind those, and that will be scalable based on the size of your event and how busy you anticipate your medical teams to be. Finally, I'll touch on mass casualty. It's something that we don't want to see at any event. By definition, we see it in almost every medical tent. We see a surge of patients that will come in and they go out, and we need to be prepared to know what our capacities are. So a few minutes ago, I labelled one of the first questions you need to ask before you actually write a plan addressing each of these key areas is, what's the capacity of your medical team? Understanding that you have 10 volunteers in your medical team is a starting point, but what you really need to derive is how many patients can those 10 people look after? Because if they can only look after 2 people of low acuity, that's very different to if those 10 medical personnel are highly skilled, highly qualified, and highly trained and can look after 40 people. Do you have the space for them to do that? Do they have the equipment? So the information that you need to have is built around some of these capacities. So if you don't know what to address with mass casualty, it's usually because we haven't asked those questions early enough. When we talk specifically around COVID, there's a whole additional layer of complexity, I suppose, for want of an easier term, that gets thrown around all of this. Medical operations and medical planning is complex in itself. It's already difficult, it's already very technical, and it's something that we find difficult to do holistically. We throw COVID into the mix, and COVID being a medical issue primarily, while it's got an impact across our finances, our business continuity, across everything that we're doing, the reality is it's primarily a medical issue. That's something that it's very easy to say, well, it's a medical problem. How do we build that into the plan? And the best way of dealing with that is having some additional COVID specific information. That way, you're not rewriting your entire medical plan every time you have to scale your COVID measures. It's very important to understand and remember that complicated information is easily forgotten and confusing. During times of emergency and crisis, this is compounded. It's very difficult for people to remember lots of layers of complex information, and in time critical situations, in high risk, high consequence situations, typical of somebody, imagine a volunteer at your event site, and they come into contact with somebody who has COVID-like symptoms, they cough, they have a sore throat. The panic that we will have amongst people who come across this scenario will mean they have limited cognitive capacity to remember directions. So we've got to keep our plans as simple, clear, and understandable as we possibly can. The consequences of misinterpretation and mismanagement are severe. We know the consequences because at the moment, the mass participation industry is unable to operate. It's operating in a very small, limited capacity in only a very small part of the world. We know the consequences are severe. Therefore, we must make sure people understand very clearly and they are comfortable with what protocols and procedures we have in place. Some of the three key areas of this is isolation areas. We must have designated isolation areas to be able to take anybody presenting with COVID symptoms and to isolate them away from everybody else. And that includes people who've come into contact with somebody who has those symptoms. We don't want to take somebody who's got COVID symptoms and take them into a medical facility straight away and contaminate that potential area, because you can lose half of your medical team. So facilities have to be designed with co-located spaces, independent spaces. There are lots of different ways of doing it, and the appropriate answer will vary from event to event. However, it's very important that everybody understands where those isolation areas are. Communication is important. Everything that we do requires good communication. And when we find ourselves in a time critical, an emergency situation, or some form of crisis, communication is usually where things break down. There's poor communication. We don't know what to communicate about. We don't communicate with the right people. So our communication procedures around what to do are just as important as those management protocols that are listed there as the final point on the page. Final points that I'd like to talk about in terms of medical planning overall before we hand over to Marcel is we so often find unnecessary information is included in medical plans. And I've got a couple of examples I'll talk through and talk to you as to why. Information has to be relevant and it has to be supportive of all elements of all plans. Craig mentioned earlier, and I've referenced it a couple of times now, medical plans have to integrate with every other operational plan that we have. There is no point coming up with 10 or 12 or 20 different plans and then doing something that breaks down 19 others. We have to have it aligned and we have to have it integrated. So I've got two examples listed here that I'll talk to explain where sometimes the kinds of information that we include in our plans is not relevant and therefore probably doesn't need to be included. The first one is around contact lists that are not supportive of communications plans. So often we see at the back end of a medical plan a list of key contacts for a medical team. At surface value, this is really, really useful information. If I need to contact anybody in medical, here's where I can contact them all. However, below the surface, this is some of the negative effect of it. When you circulate that plan, everybody can contact anybody on that contact list. So you're relying on anybody who has access to it to interpret all details in that plan to contact the right person. I have a scenario where somebody picks up the phone and calls a supervisor or a team leader in one particular area of my event, and that person is not the best person in the medical team to contact. So what we find is that everybody goes to who they think they need to know. And if they don't know who it is that they need to talk to, they usually go straight to the top because they go to somebody who will know somebody that they need to talk to. We find that that breaks down communication structures. So while it's well intended, be selective about what communication information is circulated in plans and supporting documentation. There's no point defining primary and secondary communication channels into your medical teams and then circulating big lists of contact lists so that we have 20 people calling 20 different people in your medical team and everybody's chasing each other. Another example where we include information in medical plans that's not necessary is the inclusion of detailed clinical protocols. Clinical protocols at first value show we have complexity. So they're often included in a medical plan to show we have complex systems in place, we have a high capacity on site, we have an ability to deal with higher acuity situations. But the question should be, why are we including it in there? Because unless you're passing that clinical protocol to someone in a clinical environment to interpret, usually the purpose of a medical plan is not one that listing clinical protocols will be of any value, because the person who needs to understand the information in that document hasn't got the technical background to understand it. We're far better off to make sure that we have detailed, expansive information about our communications processes than we are listing specific clinical protocols. Now, having said that, I can understand that often there's a lot of information that's put in terms of clinical practices and procedures and protocols from a compliance and approval perspective in some high compliance markets. Where you have to put them in, you put them in. That's completely understandable. The purpose of the plan here is to inform people and receive your event approval. However, if it's not a condition of approval of your event, I'd encourage you not to do it, because it just takes up space and pads out a document that becomes 50% or greater irrelevant to the person who's reading it. So the very quick summary of what I've touched on so far over the past 15 or so minutes, plans should provide a high-level functional overview of your planning and medical operations. COVID-specific information should be clear and uncomplicated. That will minimise the risk of misinterpretation and misapplication. Finally, please don't fill your medical plan with unnecessary information. The shorter plans with good quality information are so much better to understand, and they are so much clearer, and they are always much better. So please don't develop medical plans by throwing volumes of information at it to try and reflect things that you think may be irrelevant. And if you're not sure, contact somebody, get some opinions on it, and find out whether something needs to go in there or not. If there's any questions, by all means, please throw them into the chat box and we can attempt to address them tonight. But hopefully some of what I've been through over the past 15 or so minutes gives you a little bit of clarity about what can and shouldn't go into medical plans.
Thanks, Hugh. That's great. Folks, we're running a little tight on time, so if you do have to jump off, this is being recorded, as I mentioned. It'll be on the YouTube channel. Unfortunately, for some reason, technically, I couldn't get the Facebook Live up tonight, but definitely the recording will be on the YouTube channel by early next week. Whilst we throw over to Marcel to start, thanks for your feedback there on the polls, overwhelmingly fortnightly and 7 p.m. Singapore time. So that's great. I get every fortnight off now. Wonderful. So we'll start implementing that. And I'm just going to throw one more quick panel poll in here just to get a sense of where you feel that you're at with your COVID plans. And over to you, Marcel.
Perfect. Yeah, I strike a deal with you. I'll wrap it up within 10 minutes because it's not just the audience here I have to answer to. You already said in the beginning, I'm on my
It's your
honeymoon.
new wife.
Yeah. I updated a couple of my slides while I was listening because there were so many good points already said, and I wanna make this a round story. So we at the university, we have a lot of experience in transport hubs. You can see an airport here on the. I'm just wrestling with your pole that's in the way. Just give me 1 second. Yeah.
I'll get the ball out the way,
We're working with transport hubs like airports. We're working with stadia. We have a lot of experience with marathons, and we have the backing of the science or like ongoing research at university. And what we found in dealing with mass participation post-COVID or mid-COVID, we need all of those. We need to bring all of those together. And we need to learn the lessons from all of those areas. It's not just that we can learn from last year's marathon. For this year's marathon, we need to bring everything together that we can get. We need to learn much faster than comfortable. And then in normal times, the last time that I think the marathon industry had to learn so quickly were the events around Boston, roughly 10 years ago, where we also needed to update much quicker than the normal cycle of a year. We now needed to work more together. We needed to reach out to things outside the mass participation industry. And we found those lessons, they already exist. May it be aviation, may it be transport hubs, stadia, and so on. And the times are similar at the moment. And I want to show a couple of those examples, what we're doing right now in work with stadia. You mentioned Formula One, you mentioned football. And there are plans, there are a lot of bright heads working on solutions. And a couple of those questions are not very unique to a specific branch of the industry. They can be shared among each other. And if anyone discovered what works, or if anyone discovers a dead end, which is just as valuable as a solution, that can be shared. And what I show you here is an example from a stadium where basically the network that a spectator needs to go through, his route, if you want so, is drawn down. They arrive, they park in this instance, they go through the parking garage, like they need to maneuver certain obstacles along the way or certain stations along the way, like ticket checks and so on. You can see that train arrival is coming from a different route and is joining at one point. But let's not talk about too much of the detail. I want to focus your attention on those columns that you see on top, above every of those little symbols. And what you see there is the very one on the left side, the one that is in orange. That's the limiting factor. That is the one that limits how many people I can get through my system in the time that I gave myself for, let's say, the ingress process. And everything else, entry level, ticket check, infrastructure, and so on, they can tolerate more. They're all working at a much higher rate, which technically would mean I wouldn't have a queue. But the main point is I really need to know all of those capacities. You can see their units down to the T. You can see their times, how long they all take to work, and so on. You can see a lot of detail, but the necessary point now is to bring all of this together, get an overview over my route. And like Craig said, when we talk to authorities at the moment, like police or governance, it's not that they have a lot of time or resources at hand. We need to nail this. We need to inform ourselves first. And 99% of those plans are to inform myself before I invite anyone else to look at them. And a lot of those plans we made this year informed ourselves and informed us of the sad fact that we won't have an event. And that is good. It's not just to make the event happen, it's also to see if it even makes sense to go ahead. And one last thing on this slide, if you look at the very right, this is about a stadium. They identified that they have 10,824 seats. And that is 470 seats above capacity of the rest of the system. So how many seats they have, how many tickets they could sell, doesn't really matter if the whole system cannot handle it under COVID situation. And those are the things they want to find out before they actually sell those tickets. And that's why it's important to keep such an overview. If we go to marathon, we don't have seats. It would look maybe something like this, but I need to do the same thing. I need to know how capable is my start, and everything needs to be in line. And I cannot start like this full column that you see there of 13,650. I can only start down to this dotted line, because that is how I identified what the capacity of my system is. And maybe one of those, as you see here, has a much higher capacity, like 5 times higher, but that doesn't matter if I would break the system somewhere else. The point I'm trying to make is this whole balance that we normally have is completely out of whack this year, because we don't have space and we need more time. And maybe the mix of more time, less space, and less people doesn't make it financially viable in my case. I want to just summarize this. Safety is the absence of risk to a known and acceptable degree. That one is, if you take anything out of the slideshow, please let it be this one sentence. Safety is not the absence of risk, it's the absence of risk to a known and acceptable degree. And the known part here is very important, because under COVID, in the beginning, everything was unknown. Now everything is new, but we are far from the known. So if I don't know where the risk is, how big it is, and if it's not acceptable, I cannot go forward. And the opposite of low risk is not high risk. In most cases, it is unpredictability. So I don't know what happens. It might work. Maybe it worked the last couple of years, but mostly it is unpredictable. What I need to know is, where we learned a lot from theme parks, we learned a lot from aviation, from airports. We cannot just give people a point anymore. Come to this point at this time. It's not enough anymore in order to make things work and to get this balance back in place. I need to give them a whole route. Be there at this point, go then to the next point. Here's a 30-minute window for you, and so on. We all know this from airplane tickets, and everybody knows it probably from airplane tickets. So we need to transfer this to our events. It's nothing new under the sun, but it's something new in mass participation, to be a bit more rigid, be a bit more precise about this route to get this balance back. I also need to educate myself about it. Not everything is the same. What you see here is an example of filling speed. It's a live example from the project from this year, where we realized the first 15 minutes, bringing 4,000 people in is good. That works out, low risk. And then I can bring in the next hour, I can bring in all the way up to 9,000 people. And for the last 1,000 people that would be available that I can bring in to my ingress, that would take me almost as long as the 9,000 people before. And that is also something we need to learn under COVID. Maybe we have a capacity that we can reach, but maybe the risk along the way changes. And maybe I don't want to bring in the last 1,000 if they have the same risk as the full 9,000 before. Maybe this is where I need to find my balance and say, this is as far as I'm going. I leave those seats empty. I leave those tickets unsold, because the risk for the last thing that gets me under the roof, it's just not something I want to do. And maybe in your event, it looks like this from the beginning, but you need to find out before. Last couple of slides, we obviously need to put in changes. This is also a live slide from something we did this summer, is the change of the finish. What you see here is how the finish looked like in people per minute. From left to right, you see the clock running. This is a 10K race. And you see how in yellow, last year, the flow was higher than it's this year. This year in blue is a lower flow. We needed to adjust this to make it somewhere COVID safe. But I'm just showing the slide because you need to know it. Again, you need to inform yourself before you make the decision. Do I even call the authorities, talk to them, and am I wasting their time? Am I giving them the right information, like you said? Am I bringing out something that gives them a clear overview quite quickly? We can, luckily, I know that Mike Nishi is on this call. I know that a couple of the people that I studied with are on this call. And based on all of this research done in the last couple of years, we can very precisely say a lot about what happens on the course. We can predict what happens at the start. We can predict what happens at the finish. We can inform ourselves what happens on the course based on our plans. We can even say how many meters or feet do we allow people to keep in between while running. And this is also from a live project. You see from left to right, again, you see the timing. You see a red dotted line, which shows you the limit. Everything below this limit would mean you have less than 2 meters between you and the next runner available. So if you use the space you have available, you could always stay more than 2 meters apart. And you can see how this changes in this particular example. After roughly 5 minutes, the runners are coming in. The distance that they can keep between themselves is shrinking, is declining until it reaches a level between 2 and 3 meters. Then it goes back up. And that looks different for everywhere on the course. But again, it's the homework I need to make, those preparations that I need to do. I need to, from scratch, learn about COVID. And that's hard enough because that's constantly changing. I need to learn about my event, which is entirely different than last year. I need to start from zero. And maybe I don't have enough time to learn about a full marathon or full triathlon from scratch. And I need to learn about my participants as well. They're entirely new people. They went through a lot this year. And that's what you said. What happens if somebody coughs at the start? I never sat in a cinema without anyone coughing in the last few silent seconds before the screening. But I don't know what happens now. I don't know how we react. And there's a lot that I need to learn. We can help. Everyone in this group can help to inform yourself about your race, about your event, about your participants. Then we need to check, is this information in balance? Can we bring it into balance? Maybe it's still, after we learned, not the right time to bring the event back in the current form or at the current time. But we need to learn those steps at one point. And those are all not a growing pain. It hurts. Last few slides. This is what a finish can look like. Also the same thing of like people come over the finish line and they have, in this example, around 5 meters between them at the peak. So we all know what a finish looks like at the marathon or at the triathlon, people running past, and they can keep quite a lot of space in this example, 5 to 6 meters between them. We can see it easily on the screen. It's well above the 2 meters. But what happens if they slow down at the finish line? Is this the same finish, just a meter behind the line instead of in front of a line? And it condenses. Out of a sudden, the same people who just ran 5 meters from each other now only have 3 meters between each other. It's something we need to know. It's something we can't be surprised by. It's not something that outside of university or outside of the biggest races in the world people look at, but it's something you need to know. It doesn't matter if you have 5,000 or 50,000 people in your race. It is more people than you can control just by shouting at them. So you need to know that before. Once they're running, they're running. Penultimate slide. You need to know, again, based on the balance that I said in the beginning, how many people can you let in? How are they arriving via train? How do I let them out on the next stage? From the start area, I let them out on the course. And they can never fill up more that I cannot basically reduce at the same time. I always need to keep this in balance. More people coming in, I'm starting more, and so on. And the same is the case at the finish. People coming over the finish line, I need to give them their post-race experience. I need to work with them, medals, medic, and so on. And then they need to go home at one point. That means in both of those areas, it's empty, people are coming in, and then I'm emptying it again. And how far those spikes reach out, I also need to know that to see, do I have enough space? You see that in the start area on the left side, 3 times for 3 starts, people are coming in, and I then slowly release them on the course. In this example, we are not allowed to have more than 10,000 in the start area, and we know we always stay well below it. And on the right side, you see the same thing for post-finish, where our limit was 3,500. So the blue line on the right side is people passing the finish line, and the orange line, that's the one that counts, is the number of people that are post-finish, chilling, having an alcohol-free beer, resting, admiring their medal. or whatever. They have like 30 to 40 minutes to stay there, which we know is in this case what they want to do. And we as the organizers keep an overview. What does it mean for the people I have post-finish? And if this is also not in balance, I need to do something. I need to maybe restrict to 20 minutes or 25 minutes. I need to be quite precise, and I need to do it like airports do it for the longest time. And I missed a flight or two in my career. I know how restrictive they are. Okay, let's bring all of this together. Learning just from the marathons doesn't cut it this year. We need to learn from people like you, from Medic. We need to learn from people from other industries who are dealing with the problems that we have at the moment. A normal airport normally has a turnaround of around 30 times its capacity. Marathon has a turnaround of 1 times its capacity normally, except for a few examples. But we need to learn how they do it. We cannot bring all of them in at once, neither can do the airports. And we need to learn from them what are the ways to work with the participants. We need to learn things from Stadia, because they sometimes, you see Enfield here on the picture, they sometimes work on a century-old structure and need to make things fit. While Marathon is more like a pop-up industry. We pop it up in the middle of a city. That doesn't make it easier, but different. And we need to know and learn our event from scratch. We can help. There are a lot of people in the industry that can help. And I love it when yesterday I had an email from Costa Rica reaching out how we are doing things in Chicago or when working with Berlin. And I just love that. They're like 10 times smaller, but they want to know the same lessons to apply that. And we can help in the right way, feed it bit by bit. And that's how we all get to know our event from scratch. Maybe we need more than the time that we have to learn from it, and we need to postpone or cancel it, but we need to do it at one point. And we need to get our customers on board. And that's my last point now, then I'm done. Luckily, those people that we are working with who run polls, and they know Chicago, although they had to cancel their marathon, they're keeping a very tight connection to their audience, to their participants, to know how they are coping with this crisis. What do they expect when they come back? What's their appetite like? And how to work with them when we can come back under restrictions. And that's something that's very important. You don't want to be surprised on event day. For that, you need to sit down again and learn about your event as if it's the first time, and keep in contact with your audience and get them on board when you start the journey again. Chris.
Thanks so much, Marcel. And I know that you may need to head off. There's got a couple of quick questions that we'll go to. Send love and thanks to me for giving you the time to come and be with us. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
Folks, I'm going to quickly, there are a couple of questions. I'm also going to launch quickly a poll that just might give us some insights about the idea of the masterclasses and things that we're talking about. Just go quickly to the chat box here, a couple of the questions. Hi, Hugh. Some health authorities are testing organizations or venues by holding mock contact tracing exercises. Can you talk about the importance for organizations and venues to document staff and guest details should any cluster be associated with their event?
Absolutely, Chris. There's a short answer in it's so much more important than I can talk to. The long answer, I can go on and on for hours. I suppose the easiest way of highlighting the importance of it is the reproduction rate of any virus transmission. It's something that, because it becomes exponential, the impact of having a lot of people in close proximity to each other and the impact that has 14 days later and beyond that, because we don't see this, it's very possible we don't see, we can't detect COVID-19 for a period of up to 14 days. It can spread a long way. Contact tracing is our best method of identifying people who fall into that risk of exposure and isolating, and therefore we can minimize any localized outbreaks, or worse still, larger. For all of us in our space, when we're talking about any place of mass gathering, any mass participation event, it is essential. And it's absolutely essential in every definition of the word, in everything that we can do, that having that capacity to identify everybody who turns up to our event, whether they're participating volunteering, spectating, or however they're supporting and being involved, we have to know who they are and how to contact them. The only point I'd add to that as well is we have to be able to do that quickly. Being able to do it in one instance is important, but if we have a delay of 3 or 4 days, then it breaks down that contact tracing process. So the really, really important challenge to this is not just to do it accurately, it's actually to have that available so that we can grab it and run with it very, very quickly.
Fantastic, thanks. I think that's covered everything. There were a couple of requests for the slides, and I know Craig's already responded to those. The other presenters are nodding. So if you would like a copy of the slides, please just email me directly, chris@chrisrobb.asia, and we'll get those out to you. I know we've run over, but hopefully it's been worth your while. A very quick summary. I won't take up much more of your time. I think so many amazing points there. And I think there's many things I love, but one of the points that Marcel made, safety is the absence of risk to a known and acceptable degree. We're never going to be completely wiping away the risk, but it's got to be known and acceptable. I think one of the things that's come through regularly with all of the presenters for me is the interaction with the entire ecosystem, and that's the plans gelling together across all of the different elements. But it's also, you saw that great example that Marcel showed of, you know, the participant arriving and all the way through the journey. We're no longer just responsible for what happens on the event site. We need to interact with agencies to understand how safe are people on the trains, how safe are they when they're parking, where they go afterwards, and so on. You know, our event now is responsible for a much bigger ecosystem, and we need to communicate and engage with that ecosystem. I love the point that Marcel made. Plans should inform you before you share them. So this whole thing about, and I think it came across in Hugh's presentation as well, and also Craig's. This is not just about, I've got a piece of paper to cover myself if there's an issue. There's no good having a piece of paper if it's not practical, if it doesn't interact, if it doesn't create engagement, and if it doesn't interlink, if it doesn't give you some lessons up front. I think Hugh made the point a number of times. Doesn't matter how many resources you've got if you can't deploy them. It doesn't matter how many resources you've got if they get caught up in a bottleneck or if you can't communicate with them. The whole point that Craig made right at the very beginning, communicating with agencies is really tough at the moment. It's not because they don't want to speak to us, but agencies have got more bigger things on their plate at the moment, dealing with closing borders and all the medical issues and so on. Be persistent, try and get at the table. Align with the different requirements, and they will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and you're going to have to tailor your process wherever you are. WHO requirements and guidelines, obviously at the top. Your government, whether that be a federal government, Commonwealth government, whatever country you're in, your state government, your cities, and your different agencies, you need to understand all of those. The important thing that happens in Australia, and I'm not sure in terms of other jurisdictions, but in Australia, you have to have a COVID safety coordinator. If you don't need it in your country and it's not legislated, how bad can it be? How much harm can it do you to have someone who specifically looks after your COVID safety response? Communication is key. We've touched on that a number of times. The plans are only as good as your ability to deliver them across all three of these areas and every other element of your plan. There's no point having a piece of paper that sits in a drawer or on a computer that doesn't get shared and doesn't get tabletopped and worked on, but is also able to practically be delivered. Be conscious of the audience. Simple. That was one of the messages that came through from Hugh often, and I think the other presenters as well. You know, there's got to be communication that can be understood by everyone and is clear. Yeah, I guess the whole thing about COVID, it's scary. Communication of it is scary. So making sure that your communication of COVID-specific plans, whether it's around people flows, medical plans, risk management, complicated COVID plans are going to freak your volunteers out. They're going to freak your participants out. Clear, concise communication that they can deal with. And I also really love the point that Marcel made, and hopefully we've been trying to make over this whole series. We can learn from over the fence, look over the fence, learn from football, learn from rugby, learn from airports, learn from transport and other parts of the ecosystem. Really crucial. Folks, thank you for humoring us, for going over time. Hopefully it was very valuable to you. New format. We haven't tried this before. I've had some feedback already in the chat. that people feel that it's great, please join me in virtually thanking Craig Sheridan, Hugh Singe, Marcel Altenburg, particularly Marcel, taking time out on your honeymoon. Thank you so much. Have a great night, morning, evening, wherever you are, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a fortnight's time. Thanks so much. Bye for now.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.